In economics, we like to pretend we are engineers. We pull a lever expecting a specific gear to turn, but real economies are not machines. They are ecosystems. And when you pull the wrong lever, the gear that moves is often the one you never saw coming. For the last several years, the United States has been running a live experiment in this mistake. Not in a classroom, not in a model, but on factory floors in Ohio, in boardrooms in Detroit, and quietly across the border in Ontario. We were told the logic was simple. Build economic walls, raise tariffs, make it painful to produce elsewhere. And companies will come home. It sounded strong. It sounded obvious. It sounded like common sense. But sledgehammers are very good at breaking things. They are terrible tools for building complex systems. If you want to understand why one of America's most iconic companies is weaker today and why Canada is stronger, you need to follow what actually happened after that lever was pulled. Stay with me. Because the story most people think they know is not the story the data tells. What makes this story dangerous is not that the idea was radical. It's that it felt reasonable. You were told this was about protecting workers, about saving towns like Lordstown, about making sure companies like General Motors built cars where they were sold. And if you're watching this, chances are you believed some part of that promise because it spoke to something real. Stagnant wages, closed factories, a sense that the system had stopped working for people who did everything right. So tariffs became the answer, not as a tool, but as a weapon. Steel, aluminum, cars themselves. The logic was brutally simple. Raise the cost of doing business abroad, and production will snap back home. But global industries do not snap. They bend. They reroute. They escape. And here's the critical mistake almost everyone missed. The policy wasn't just pressuring companies. It was teaching them where not to build their future. To see why that mattered and why General Motors paid the price, we need to look at how deeply integrated this system already was long before the first tariff ever hit. To understand why this went so wrong, you have to understand what the North American auto industry actually is. It is not three separate national industries. It is one system. Over 4 decades, the United States, Canada, and Mexico built a single, deeply integrated machine. Not by accident, by design. A single car part doesn't live in one country. It moves. It crosses borders again and again, cast in one place, machined in another, assembled somewhere else, installed somewhere else entirely. This wasn't inefficiency. It was optimization. Each border crossing stripped out cost. Each specialization increased speed. Each agreement turned the border into a line on a map, not a toll booth. By the time the first tariff was even discussed, this system had already been tuned for 40 years. Every penny mattered. Every delay mattered. And that's the part policymakers misunderstood. They didn't see a system. They saw leverage. They believed you could shock this machine into obedience, that you could threaten it, tax it, and force it to behave differently. But when you introduce fear into a system built on precision, you don't get control. You get fracture. And the first fracture came fast. The bill didn't arrive slowly. It arrived all at once. In the middle of 2018, General Motors went to its investors with a number that cut through all the slogans. $1 billion. That was the cost. Not in theory. Not over a decade, in a single year. Steel and aluminum tariffs sold as protection had wiped out $1 billion of profit almost overnight. Money that was supposed to fund research, wages, the electric transition. Instead, it vanished into higher input costs. And this is where abstraction became pain. Because in the auto industry, margins are thin, pennies matter. Volume is everything. A sudden spike in material costs isn't a headache. It's a heart attack. GM wasn't alone, but GM was exposed. They couldn't just switch suppliers. Steel mills aren't apps you uninstall and replace. The tariffs hit again and again every time a component crossed the border. So GM did what bleeding companies always do. They cut. Plants were unallocated. Communities were stunned. And the workers these policies were meant to protect were the first to feel the impact. If you think this was the worst of it, stay with me. Because this was only the first crack. The deeper damage was already spreading through the system. What most people never saw was the trap hidden inside the policy itself. The tariffs were supposed to protect American manufacturing. But the way modern manufacturing actually works meant they did the opposite. Here's why. If you build a car inside the United States using a North American supply chain, you don't pay the tariff once. You pay it again and again and again. Every subassembly that uses steel or aluminum carries that cost forward. It compounds. But if you build the same car overseas and ship it in fully assembled, you skip most of that punishment. You pay a single border cost instead of dozens. So the policy quietly rewired incentives. It didn't reward building in America. It penalized it. This is the kind of mistake that only shows up when you understand systems, not slogans. Washington saw borders as pressure points, but the supply chain saw them as friction. And when friction increases, capital doesn't argue, it moves. Companies stopped asking how to grow. They started asking how to survive the next shock, the next threat, the next tweet. And survival planning looks very different from innovation. This is the moment where the story stops being about tariffs and starts being about flight. Because while Washington was escalating pressure, someone else was quietly offering relief. And that's where the balance of power began to shift. The second shock wasn't a number. It was fear. As tariffs escalated, something more corrosive than cost entered the system: uncertainty. The threat wasn't just what had already been taxed. It was what might be taxed next. A 25% tariff on cars from Canada, from Mexico, from your closest partners. Maybe tomorrow, maybe next week, maybe with a single announcement. For companies like General Motors, this changed everything. You can plan around high costs. You cannot plan around chaos. Factories run on schedules. Supply chains run on predictability. Investment runs on trust, and that trust collapsed. Executives stopped greenlighting long-term projects. Engineers stopped designing for scale. Boardrooms shifted from offense to defense. Instead of asking, where should we build the future, they asked, where is safest if this gets worse? And this is the fatal miscalculation. The policy assumed companies would absorb pain and comply, but corporations don't feel loyalty. They feel risk. So when Washington governed by threat, capital did the only rational thing. It started looking for shelter, not outside North America, not across an ocean, just across a border. And that's when Canada stopped being a bystander and started becoming the alternative. To see how that choice reshaped the fate of workers on both sides of the border, we need to shift our focus away from boardrooms and toward people. This is the part where the story stops being abstract, because this is where you enter the frame. If a plant closes in Lordstown, it isn't a statistic. It's a mortgage that suddenly doesn't make sense. It's a kid pulled out of a school. It's a town that loses another reason to believe in tomorrow. You were told these tariffs were a shield, that they would protect jobs like yours, communities like yours. But when the costs hit, they didn't land on spreadsheets first. They landed on people. Shifts were cut. Suppliers were squeezed. Small family-owned shops, tier 2, tier 3 manufacturers were forced to eat costs they couldn't pass on. Some survived, many didn't. And while all of this was happening, cars got more expensive. You saw it on the lot. Sticker shock, fewer options, more debt. You paid the tariff too, just not at the border. And here's the cruel irony. The instability that hurt American workers made Canadian workers more secure. Not because they worked harder, but because their system offered something yours no longer did: predictability. If this feels personal, it should. Because policy doesn't fail in theory. It fails in lives. And the consequences didn't stop at the border. They rippled outward. What happened next wasn't just an industrial shift. It was a geopolitical one. When the United States destabilized its own supply chain, it didn't create independence. It exposed dependence. Electric vehicles are not powered by steel. They are powered by minerals: lithium, nickel, cobalt. And here is the uncomfortable truth. The United States does not control enough of them. Canada does. While Washington was fighting yesterday's trade wars, Ottawa was quietly positioning itself as tomorrow's gatekeeper. Not by confrontation, by alignment. They secured trade certainty. They marketed stability. They made themselves indispensable to the North American transition. And global capital noticed battery plants don't float. They anchor ecosystems. Once the batteries move north, assembly follows. Gravity decides. The result is a silent shift in leverage. Detroit no longer dictates terms alone. Its future now runs through Ontario and Quebec, through mines, processing plants, and policies written elsewhere. This is the cost of confusing toughness with strategy. Because in the global economy, power doesn't come from walls. It comes from being unavoidable. And as this new reality sets in, the question is no longer what went wrong. It's what happens next. Because from here, there are only a few possible futures. From here, the future doesn't split into dozens of paths. It narrows to three. The first is the optimistic scenario. The United States learns the lesson. It stops governing by shock. It rebuilds trust, secures minerals, and treats integration as strength, not weakness. In this future, America doesn't retreat from North America, it leads it again. But this requires coherence. And coherence is hard. The second scenario is the muddle through. Tariffs fade, subsidies rise. Policy lurches forward without a clear center. Manufacturing survives, but the heart of the value chain stays north. America assembles, Canada supplies, dependence becomes normal. Then there is the third path, the quiet decline. In this future, the United States keeps fighting yesterday's battles. It protects old industries while starving the new ones of stability. Capital continues to hedge. Talent follows certainty. And the most critical components of the economy, batteries, materials, leverage, are no longer controlled at home. None of these futures are inevitable. But all of them are already in motion. This is what economists mean when we talk about path dependence. Small decisions compound. Systems remember. And the hardest truth is this: by the time a decline feels obvious, it is usually irreversible. Which brings us to the final question. Not about trade, not about Canada, but about choice. So who actually won this experiment? Not the workers in Ohio who were promised stability, not the families who watched factories go dark, not the consumers paying more for less. The real winners were the ones who understood something fundamental. In a system this complex, power belongs to whoever controls the future inputs. Canada didn't win by outmuscling the United States. They won by outthinking it. They didn't build walls. They built certainty. They didn't fight the supply chain. They became indispensable to it. And General Motors, once the symbol of American industrial dominance, didn't collapse. But it lost something just as important: control. When the core of your product depends on decisions made elsewhere, you are no longer sovereign. You are reactive. This didn't happen because America lacked strength. It happened because strength was mistaken for pressure and strategy was replaced with slogans. And that leaves us with the only question that matters now. Do we keep pulling levers and hoping the right gears turn? Or do we finally admit that in a world built on integration, the future belongs to those who design systems, not those who try to smash them? If you want to understand what this means for the next industry, the next crisis, and the next decade, stay with me, because this story isn't over.